When he heard the cleaning lady playing the piano, the millionaire was paralyzed by the music. The same music his wife used to play before she disappeared 20 years ago. Richard Walker leaned back in his leather chair, staring out the large, rain-streaked windows of his penthouse office. The city below moved in its usual chaotic rhythm, but all he could hear was silence. The kind of silence that reminded him just how empty his life had become. 20 years had passed since Emily disappeared, and despite the years of success that followed, nothing filled the void she left behind. For Richard, everything always seemed to come back to that one haunting memory. Emily sitting at the grand piano in their home, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the keys, playing that same soft melody over and over again. A tune that was so personal, so specific to her, that it might as well have been a secret code between them. Then, one day, she vanished, without a word, without a trace. Since then, Richard's life had been defined by his work, his fortune, and his isolation. On this particular rainy afternoon, Richard found himself inspecting one of his luxury hotels in Manhattan. He preferred to handle things personally. It gave him a sense of control, something he'd craved since the day his life fell apart. As he made his way through the grand lobby, his footsteps echoed against the marble floors, and the staff stood quietly, almost reverently, as he passed. They were used to his presence, to the man who owned more properties than most people could count, but seemed to enjoy none of them. He was halfway through his routine walk when something stopped him in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. A faint, familiar sound filled the air. Notes from a piano, drifting softly from somewhere deep within the hotel. But it wasn't just any song. It was her song. Emily's song. The same haunting melody she used to play every evening before she disappeared. Richard's pulse quickened. For a moment, he thought he was losing his mind. After all, it had been 20 years, but the music was unmistakable. Compelled by something deep and unshakable, he followed the sound down a narrow corridor, past the elegant dining hall, and toward the service area of the hotel. As he turned a corner, he found himself in a small kitchen where the staff would sometimes gather after hours. And there, sitting at a worn-out piano in the corner, was a young woman. She looked up, startled, as Richard approached. The music stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in the air. She was dressed in the simple uniform of the hotel's cleaning staff, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her hands rested awkwardly on the piano keys, as if she wasn't sure if she should continue playing or stand up and run. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone was here." Richard didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. It was impossible. How could she know that song? The melody had been something only Emily knew, something deeply personal between the two of them. Yet, here was this young woman, someone he had never seen before, playing it perfectly, note for note. "Where did you learn that?" Richard finally asked, his voice quiet but firm. The woman hesitated, glancing at the keys before meeting his gaze again. I don't really know. My mother used to play it when I was little, but I don't remember much about her. She left me at an orphanage when I was a baby." Richard's heart clenched. An orphan? The mystery around her deepened, but it didn't make sense. This song wasn't popular. It wasn't something you'd hear anywhere, let alone from someone who grew up in an orphanage. The more he thought about it, the more questions filled his mind. "What's your name?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the strange coincidence. "Sarah?" she replied, her voice still soft, almost timid. Sarah, a name as simple as it was ordinary, and yet there was something about her, something familiar in her features, her eyes, perhaps, or the way she held herself. Richard found himself staring, trying to place what it was about her that seemed to tug at his memory. "And your mother? She never told you anything about where you came from?" He pressed, feeling a strange pull to know more. Sarah shook her head. "No, she left when I was too young to remember much. Just the music. That's all I really have from her." Richard's mind raced. It was impossible, wasn't it? Emily had disappeared without a trace. He had searched for her for years, but eventually he had been forced to accept that she was gone, probably dead. And yet, here was this woman, playing Emily's song, a woman with no family, no past, and no answers. Something about this felt too close, too familiar. Richard didn't believe in coincidences. And this was no coincidence. But what did it mean? Was this young woman somehow connected to Emily? Could she be the key to finally unlocking the mystery of what happened all those years ago? Without another word, Richard turned and left the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the rain was drowned out by the questions swirling in his mind. He knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning, and whatever answers were waiting for him, they wouldn't be easy to face. Richard's thoughts lingered on the conversation with Sarah long after he left the hotel. He found himself pacing in his penthouse, the same questions running through his mind on an endless loop. How had she learned that song? The mere thought of Emily's melody brought a wave of emotions crashing over him. Sadness, confusion, and strangely enough, hope. For 20 years, there had been nothing. No clues, no signs, just a void. But now, this song had resurfaced, stirring up memories Richard had long tried to bury. He stood at the large window of his apartment, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the city lights sparkled in the mist. The last time he had felt this kind of restlessness was in the early days after Emily had disappeared. Back then, he had spent sleepless nights wondering where she was, what had happened to her. He had hired private investigators, scoured every corner of the city, and even followed a few false leads. But eventually, the trail had gone cold, and with it, any hope of finding her. But now, could it be that Sarah was connected to Emily in some way? It felt ridiculous even thinking it, but something in his gut told him this was more than just a coincidence. He needed answers. He needed to know more about this girl and her past. That night, Richard made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, an old private investigator he had worked with during Emily's disappearance. His name was Frank, a man known for digging up the kinds of secrets people wanted to keep buried. Walker. Frank's gruff voice greeted him on the phone. "It's been a while. Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I need your help," Richard said, wasting no time with pleasantries. "There's someone I need you to look into. Her name's Sarah. She works at one of my hotels. And I need to know everything about her, where she came from, her family, everything." Frank was silent for a moment. "Sarah, huh? What's this about?" "I'm not sure yet," Richard admitted. "But I think she might be connected to Emily." Frank let out a low whistle. "Still chasing that ghost, huh?" Richard clenched his jaw. "Just do the job, Frank. I'll send you the details. I need answers as soon as possible." All right, I'll get on it," Frank replied. "I'll call you when I have something." After hanging up the phone, Richard couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, he would finally get some clarity. Maybe this time, the answers he had been searching for would finally come. The next day, Richard couldn't resist the urge to visit the hotel again. He told himself it was for work, but deep down, he knew the real reason. As he made his way through the lobby, he spotted Sarah cleaning near the entrance. She looked up and saw him, her expression a mix of surprise and nervousness. "Mr. Walker," she greeted him politely. "Can I help you with something?" Richard hesitated for a moment. He hadn't planned on talking to her, but now that she was in front of him, the questions came flooding back. "You mentioned your mother used to play that song," he began, keeping his tone casual. "Do you remember anything else about her?" Sarah paused, as if searching for memories that were long faded. "Not really," she said after a moment. "I was really young when she left. All I have are bits and pieces. Sometimes I wonder if the things I remember are even real." Richard nodded, understanding the frustration of chasing memories that felt more like dreams. "What about the song? Did she ever say where she learned it?" Sarah shook her head. "No, it was just something she always played. I didn't think much of it." "Do you have anything of hers? Photos? Letters?" Richard asked, pushing gently, though he was careful not to sound too intrusive. "No," Sarah said quietly. "When she left me at the orphanage, she didn't leave anything behind." That familiar pang of sorrow hit Richard again, but this time, it was mixed with something else. Sympathy. He could see the pain in Sarah's eyes, the same loneliness that had haunted him for 2 decades. He wanted to help her, but more than that, he needed to understand why this girl, this stranger, was so deeply tied to the memories of the woman he had lost. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and frustration for Richard. He kept busy with meetings and business affairs, but his mind was always on Sarah and the mystery surrounding her. Every time he thought about that song, something gnawed at him, a sense that the past was creeping back in ways he hadn't anticipated. He spent hours replaying his last conversation with her, trying to make sense of the connection, trying to remember any details from Emily's disappearance that might help him. Finally, late one evening, the call came. Richard had been waiting, pacing in his penthouse like a caged animal, and when the phone rang, his heart raced. "Walker!" Frank's voice crackled through the line. "I've got some information for you. You're not going to believe this." Richard immediately straightened, gripping the phone tighter. "What did you find?" "I looked into that girl, Sarah," Frank began, his tone serious. "She's got no family, just like she said. Records show she was left at an orphanage when she was just a baby. No name, no nothing. But here's where it gets interesting. The orphanage she was dropped off at, it's the same one you and I checked out years ago when we were looking into Emily." Richard's blood ran cold. He remembered that orphanage all too well. It had been one of the dead ends in his search for Emily, a lead that had gone nowhere, until now. "You're sure?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "Positive," Frank replied. "I double-checked everything. The timeline lines up too. Sarah was dropped off there about a year after Emily disappeared." Richard could hardly breathe. His mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. Sarah's age, her being abandoned at the same orphanage. It all pointed to one terrifying, exhilarating possibility. "And there's more," Frank continued, his voice lowering. "I talked to a few people who used to work there back then. No one remembers who dropped her off, but there was something strange about the whole situation. No one came back for her. No one asked questions. It was like she was just forgotten." Richard stood in silence, staring out at the city lights. Forgotten, just like Emily had been. His mind reeled with the implications. Was it possible that Sarah was connected to Emily in more ways than one? Could she be their daughter? "Walker, you still there?" Frank asked, his voice pulling Richard from his thoughts. "Yeah," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "I'm here." "Look, I know this is a lot to take in," Frank continued, "but I think you need to dig deeper. There's something here, something big. You're not dealing with a coincidence. If you want, I can keep looking." Richard paused for a moment, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to say no, to stop this now before he uncovered something too painful to handle. But another part of him, the part that had never stopped hoping for answers, knew he had to keep going. "Yeah," Richard said finally, his voice steadying. "Keep digging. I need to know everything." After he hung up, Richard sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. If Sarah was his daughter, it meant that Emily had been pregnant when she disappeared. Something he had never known, never even suspected. It also meant that whoever had taken Emily had taken his child too. The thought sent a chill through him. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Emily had vanished without a trace, and all these years, he had believed she was gone. But now, there was this possibility, this terrifying possibility that she had been alive, that she had given birth, and that their child had been left in an orphanage to fend for herself. The next day, Richard returned to the hotel, his emotions a storm brewing beneath the surface. He spotted Sarah cleaning near the lobby, and despite everything swirling in his mind, he knew he had to approach her carefully. He had no proof yet, no certainty, only suspicions, but he had to know more. "Sarah," Richard called as he approached her. She turned, looking surprised to see him again. "Mr. Walker, is everything all right?" "I need to ask you something," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "About your past. I know you said you don't remember much, but did you ever hear anything about where you came from? Anything at all?" Sarah frowned, thinking hard. "Not really. The orphanage didn't have any records about me. All I know is that I was left there when I was a baby. Why are you asking?" Richard hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's just, I think there's more to your past than you realize. I've been looking into it, and I found out that you were dropped off at an orphanage that I'm familiar with." Sarah looked confused. "Familiar with how?" Richard took a deep breath. "It's the same place I searched years ago when I was looking for my wife. She disappeared about 20 years ago, around the same time you were left there. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by the connection. You think your wife might have had something to do with me being there? I don't know yet, Richard admitted, but the timeline adds up. And the song you played on the piano, it's the same one she used to play. Sarah stared at him, her face pale as she processed his words. But that doesn't make sense. I don't remember anything about your wife, or about any of this. I know, Richard said softly, but I think we need to find out. There's something here, Sarah, something big, and I think it's connected to both of us. Sarah stood there in stunned silence, her mind clearly racing with the implications of what Richard had just said. Finally, she nodded, a look of determination crossing her face. Okay, she said quietly. Let's find out the truth. In the days that followed their conversation, the weight of Richard's suspicions grew heavier. He couldn't shake the idea that Sarah was more than just a random girl with a mysterious past. There was too much pointing toward a deeper connection, too many coincidences to ignore. He found himself constantly revisiting the past, memories of Emily flooding back with a new sense of urgency. What if she had been taken from him not just as his wife, but as a mother too? The thought gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Despite the storm of emotions brewing inside, Richard did his best to keep up appearances. He continued to run his empire with the same cold efficiency that had earned him his fortune. But inside, he was unraveling. Every moment he wasn't working, he was thinking about Sarah, about the possibility that she was his daughter and what that meant for everything he thought he knew about his life. One afternoon, as Richard sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Frank. Got something you should see. Meet me at your place tonight. 7 p.m. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what Frank had uncovered, but the message sent a jolt of both excitement and dread through him. He wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever new piece of the puzzle Frank had found, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. That evening, Frank arrived at Richard's penthouse, carrying a small manila folder. His expression was serious, more so than usual, and Richard knew immediately that whatever was inside that folder was important. I dug a little deeper, like you asked, Frank said, setting the folder on the table, and I found something you're gonna want to see. Richard took the folder, his hands feeling unsteady. He opened it to find a few grainy photos, old documents, and a handwritten letter. As he flipped through the pages, one thing caught his eye, a birth certificate. His heart pounded as he looked closer, reading the details. The certificate was for a baby girl, born approximately 9 months after Emily's disappearance. The mother's name was listed as Emily Walker. Richard stared at the paper, his vision blurring as the reality of what he was holding sank in. Emily had given birth. Sarah wasn't just connected to his wife, she was their daughter. The girl standing in front of that piano, playing Emily's song, was his own flesh and blood. He looked up at Frank, his voice hoarse. How did you find this? It wasn't easy, Frank admitted, sitting down across from him. I had to pull a lot of strings, call in some favors, but I tracked down the hospital where she was born. The problem is, after Sarah was born, Emily disappeared again. No one knows what happened to her after that. Richard felt like the ground was falling out from beneath him. So Emily? She was alive long enough to have the baby. Yeah, Frank said quietly. But after that, she vanished. No death certificate, no trace. It's like she just disappeared. Richard's mind raced. For years, he had believed Emily was gone, dead even. But now, he knew she had survived long enough to give birth to their daughter. What happened after that was still a mystery, but this new piece of information changed everything. Sarah doesn't know, does she? Frank asked, watching Richard carefully. No, Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She has no idea. You gonna tell her? Richard hesitated. He didn't know how to break this kind of news to someone, especially someone like Sarah, who had grown up without any family, without knowing who she truly was. How could he possibly explain to her that not only was her mother someone she never knew, but her father had been right in front of her this whole time? I have to, Richard finally said. She deserves to know the truth. Frank nodded. Just be careful, Walker. This kind of thing, it's not easy for anyone to handle. After Frank left, Richard sat alone with the birth certificate in his hands, the weight of it pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. Emily had been alive. Sarah was their daughter. And now, it was up to him to figure out what happened to the woman he had loved, and how to make things right with the daughter he never knew he had. Richard spent the next few days grappling with the enormity of what he had learned. Emily had been alive, and Sarah, this girl who had unknowingly stumbled into his life, was their daughter. The revelation sent his mind spinning in 1,000 directions, but the most pressing question remained. What had happened to Emily after Sarah was born? Why had she disappeared without a trace? And most terrifyingly, who had taken her in the first place? He needed answers. But first, he needed to tell Sarah the truth. Richard wasn't sure how she would react, but he knew this wasn't something he could keep from her. She deserved to know who she was, and more importantly, she deserved to know who her mother was. It was a rainy afternoon when Richard finally gathered the courage to approach Sarah. She was working as usual, cleaning in the lobby of the hotel, when Richard walked in. He stood there for a moment, watching her from a distance, trying to figure out how to start the conversation. She had no idea how much her life was about to change. "Sarah?" he called softly, stepping toward her. She looked up from her work, surprised to see him again. "Mr. Walker. Hi. Can we talk for a minute? Somewhere private?" Richard asked, his tone gentle but serious. Sarah looked puzzled but nodded. "Sure, I guess." They moved to a quiet corner of the hotel, a small lounge that was empty in the mid-afternoon. Richard gestured for her to sit, and for a moment, they both sat in silence. The weight of what he was about to tell her seemed too heavy for words, but he knew he had to start somewhere. "I found something," Richard began, his voice soft but firm. "Something about your past, and about my past, too." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Sarah, I've been looking into your background, trying to find out more about where you came from, and I found some answers." Sarah shifted in her seat, clearly unsettled by his words. "What kind of answers?" "About your mother," Richard said, his eyes locking with hers. "And about who she was." Sarah froze, her expression tightening. "What do you know about my mother?" Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the birth certificate Frank had given him. He handed it to Sarah, watching as her eyes scanned the document. At first, she looked confused, and her eyes widened as she processed what she was reading. "Emily Walker," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. That's your wife's name." Richard nodded slowly. "She's also your mother." Sarah stared at him, disbelief etched on her face. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know it's hard to believe," Richard said softly. "But it's the truth. After you were born, your mother disappeared, just like she did from my life. We both lost her. Sarah, I've been searching for answers about what happened to her ever since." Sarah's hands shook as she held the birth certificate. She looked up at Richard, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "So you're saying that you're my father?" Richard nodded, the words catching in his throat. "Yes, I'm your father." For a long moment, Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling from the revelation. She had spent her entire life wondering who she was, where she had come from, and now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. The man sitting in front of her wasn't just her boss. He was her father. The weight of it felt overwhelming. "But why didn't I know?" Sarah finally asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't you find me sooner?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know you existed. When Emily disappeared, I had no idea she was pregnant. I thought she was gone for good. It's only recently that I started digging into your past and realized the truth." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, clearly struggling to keep her emotions in check. "So, my whole life, I've been alone, and I didn't have to be." Richard's heart broke at her words. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he wasn't sure if she would accept it. He had never been a father, and now, he was faced with the reality that he had a daughter he never knew. I'm sorry, Richard said quietly. I wish I had known sooner. I would have come for you. I would have made sure you were never alone. Sarah looked down at the birth certificate again, her tears falling onto the paper. She didn't say anything for a long time, and Richard wasn't sure what else he could say. The truth was out, but it had opened up a new world of questions that neither of them had answers to yet. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What happened to her? To Emily? Richard shook his head. I don't know. That's what I've been trying to figure out. All I know is that she was alive long enough to give birth to you. After that, she vanished again. Sarah wiped her eyes, looking up at Richard with a mixture of sadness and determination. We need to find her. Richard nodded. We will, I promise you. We'll find out what happened to her. In that moment, there was a silent understanding between them. They were no longer strangers bound by a simple melody. They were father and daughter, united in their search for the truth about the woman who had been taken from both of them. The days following Richard's revelation were filled with an uncomfortable quiet between him and Sarah. The weight of the truth seemed to hang in the air, neither of them knowing exactly how to move forward from this newfound relationship. Richard, always a man of action, was unsure how to handle the emotional complexity of being a father to a woman he had never known. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed lost in a sea of emotions, confusion, anger, and a deep yearning for answers about her mother. Determined not to let the silence stretch on, Richard returned to what he knew best: action. He poured his resources into uncovering more about Emily's fate. With Frank still working on the case, Richard felt he was getting closer to the answers he had been searching for all these years. But the urgency was even greater now. He wasn't just looking for closure, he was looking for Emily for Sarah's sake too. She deserved to know her mother. One evening, as the rain pattered against the windows of his penthouse, Richard received another call from Frank. I found something, Frank said, his voice more serious than usual. Richard immediately sat up, his pulse quickening. What is it? I've been digging into the records from around the time Sarah was born. There's a detail I missed earlier, but it's important, Frank explained. There was a witness, someone who claimed to have seen Emily after she gave birth. Richard's heart raced. Who? Where can I find them? Not so fast, Frank cautioned. The witness is an old woman now. Her name is Maria. She was a nurse at the hospital where Emily gave birth. She doesn't remember much. Years have passed. But she told me something strange. After Sarah was born, she overheard a conversation between two men. They were discussing Emily, and it sounded like they were planning to move her somewhere, against her will. Richard's hand tightened around the phone. Where did they take her? That's the problem, Frank said, frustration clear in his voice. Maria doesn't know. She wasn't involved in anything beyond that overheard conversation. But it's a lead. It means Emily didn't just vanish on her own. Someone took her. Richard's mind spun. Someone had taken Emily. Again. It was almost too much to bear. After all these years, she hadn't left of her own free will. She had been taken, and if that was true, then there was a chance she was still alive. Do you have any idea who these men were? Richard asked, his voice low and controlled. I'm working on it, Frank replied. But if what Maria heard is true, we're dealing with something bigger than just a kidnapping. This wasn't random. These men had a purpose. Richard's jaw clenched. The idea that someone had orchestrated this, had taken Emily and kept her away all these years, filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in a long time. But more than that, it filled him with determination. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. He wasn't going to let Emily stay lost. Keep digging, Richard said, his voice hard. I want to know everything. Later that night, Richard sat down with Sarah to tell her what Frank had uncovered. She had been keeping to herself more than usual, processing everything in her own quiet way. But when Richard told her about the nurse and the conversation she overheard, something in Sarah's expression changed. So, they took her, Sarah asked, her voice shaky. She didn't just leave me? Richard nodded. It looks that way. We don't have all the answers yet, but we're getting closer. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. Then, she looked at Richard, and the vulnerability in her gaze caught him off guard. I've spent my whole life thinking I was abandoned. I thought, maybe she didn't want me. But if she was taken... She wanted you, Richard said firmly. She was taken before she had the chance to protect you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Richard thought she might pull away again, retreating into the emotional walls she had built around herself. But instead, she surprised him. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I want to find her. Whatever it takes." Richard felt a surge of pride. Despite everything she had been through, despite the pain and confusion of learning who she really was, Sarah was strong, stronger than he had realized. "We'll find her," Richard promised. "Together." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Frank continued to dig into the mystery, trying to track down anyone who might have been involved in Emily's disappearance. Meanwhile, Richard and Sarah began working together to piece together what they knew. The bond between them grew as they spent more time together, united by their shared mission. Richard found himself opening up to Sarah in ways he hadn't expected, and she, in turn, began to trust him more. It wasn't an easy transition. There were still moments of tension, moments when the reality of their relationship felt too strange, too sudden. But they were getting through it. Together. One evening, as they sat in Richard's penthouse, surrounded by documents and old photos of Emily, Richard looked over at Sarah and realized just how much she had changed his life in such a short time. She had brought hope back into his world, a world that had been so dark for so long. And now, with her by his side, he felt like they might actually have a chance to find Emily, to bring her home. But even as hope filled him, a dark thought lingered in the back of Richard's mind. If they were getting closer to the truth, how long before those who had taken Emily realized they were being hunted? The tension was palpable as Richard and Sarah continued their search for Emily. They had found more pieces of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. Every new discovery brought more questions, and as the days passed, the looming threat of the unknown grew. Richard could sense it, the feeling that they were being watched, that whoever had taken Emily all those years ago was aware of their investigation. Sarah, for her part, seemed to have found a new sense of purpose in the search for her mother. She had thrown herself into it with a determination that surprised Richard. They spent hours going over old documents, tracking down anyone who might have known something about Emily's disappearance. But despite their best efforts, they still hadn't found the crucial piece of information that would lead them directly to her. It was late one evening when Frank called again. Richard answered immediately, his heart racing as he heard the familiar voice on the other end. "I've got something big," Frank said, his tone urgent. "I've been following up on that lead, the one about the men who took Emily. Turns out they were working for someone." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Who?" "That's the thing," Frank continued. "It's someone from your past, Walker, someone with a grudge. His name is Dominic Reyes." The name hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Dominic Reyes, a name he hadn't heard in years, but one he hadn't forgotten. Reyes had been a business rival of Richard's years ago, a man who had tried to take over Richard's real estate empire in a hostile bid. When Richard had outmaneuvered him, Reyes had sworn revenge, but Richard had assumed the threats were nothing more than empty words. Now, it seemed, Reyes had made good on that promise. "Reyes," Richard repeated, his voice cold. "He's behind this." Frank's voice was grim. "Looks like it. He hired the men who took Emily. From what I've been able to piece together, Reyes wanted to hit you where it hurt the most, your family. He had her taken, and when he found out she was pregnant, he had her kept away. He made sure you never found out about Sarah." Richard felt a surge of rage, his hands trembling as he held the phone. Reyes had orchestrated everything, the years of pain, the loneliness, the guilt. Reyes had been behind it all, and now, after all this time, Richard finally had a name to put to the face of the man who had stolen his life from him. "Where is he?" Richard demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm working on it," Frank replied. "He's been keeping a low profile, but I've got a lead on one of his associates. I think we can track him down. But Walker, this guy is dangerous. If you go after him, you need to be ready for what comes next." "I've been ready for 20 years, Richard said, his voice hard. "I'm not stopping now." After hanging up, Richard sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process the information. Dominic Reyes. The man who had taken everything from him was still out there, still pulling the strings. And now that Richard knew the truth, he wasn't going to rest until Reyes paid for what he had done. But as his mind raced with thoughts of revenge, Richard also knew he had to be careful. Reyes wasn't just a petty criminal, he was powerful, connected, and dangerous. If they were going to confront him, they needed to be smart about it. That evening, Richard sat down with Sarah to tell her everything. She had a right to know who had taken her mother, who had stolen the life they were meant to have. When he told her the name, Sarah's face went pale. "Dominic Reyes," she repeated, her voice shaky. "Why would he do this?" Richard explained the history between him and Reyes, how their rivalry had turned bitter when Richard had won a major deal that Reyes had been after. It had been a long time ago, but for someone like Reyes, a man with a fragile ego and a thirst for power, it had been enough to fuel a vendetta that spanned decades. Sarah sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation. So, all of this, everything that happened to Mom, to me, it was all because of some business deal. Richard nodded, his expression grim. Reyes wanted to hurt me, and he did. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. How could someone be that cruel? How could he do this to us? Richard didn't have an answer. He had spent years asking himself the same questions, wondering how anyone could be capable of such cruelty. But now wasn't the time for questions. Now was the time for action. "We're going to find him," Richard said, his voice firm, "and we're going to make him pay for what he's done." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "But what if he comes after us? If he's still out there, he could try to stop us." Richard reached out and took her hand, his grip steady. "I won't let him hurt you, Sarah. Not again. This time, we're going to end this." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Richard worked closely with Frank, tracking down Reyes's associates and following every lead they could find. They uncovered a network of corruption that stretched far beyond what Richard had imagined, with Reyes at the center of it all. It was clear that confronting him wouldn't be easy, but Richard didn't care. He was ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the tension between Richard and Sarah began to ease. They had found a common purpose in their search for Emily, and it had brought them closer. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when the reality of their new relationship felt overwhelming, but they were learning to navigate it together. And as they closed in on Reyes, Richard felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. The end was in sight. The man who had taken everything from him was within reach, and soon, Richard would have his chance to make things right. But even as he prepared for the confrontation ahead, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him, Reyes wouldn't go down without a fight, and the closer they got to him, the more dangerous things would become. The anticipation of what was to come weighed heavily on Richard. The revelation that Dominic Reyes was behind Emily's disappearance was more than just a discovery. It was a call to action. For years, Richard had lived with the unresolved pain of losing his wife, and now he was faced with the chance to not only find her but also confront the man responsible for their suffering. Sarah had grown quieter since learning the truth. She still showed the same determination to find her mother, but something had shifted. Richard could see the turmoil in her eyes, the weight of her identity, the sudden reality of having a father, and the brutal truth of who had taken her family from her. Despite her strength, Richard worried about how she would handle the confrontation with Reyes, knowing how deeply personal this had become for both of them. One evening, as they sat in Richard's penthouse poring over maps and information about Reyes's whereabouts, Sarah suddenly broke the silence. "I still can't wrap my head around it," she said, her voice barely audible. "All these years I thought I was abandoned. I thought maybe my mother didn't want me. But to know she was taken, that she didn't have a choice." Richard looked up from the papers spread across the table. "I know it's a lot to process," he said gently. "But you have to remember, none of this was your fault. Your mother loved you. She fought for you." Sarah stared down at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the maps absently. "But why didn't anyone come for me? Why didn't you know?" The question cut Richard deeply. He had asked himself the same thing over and over in the past few days. How had he missed the signs? How had he not known that Emily had been alive long enough to give birth to Sarah? It was a question that haunted him. "I didn't know she was pregnant when she disappeared," Richard admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't even know there was a child to look for. If I had known..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If Richard had known, nothing would have stopped him from finding Sarah, from rescuing her from a life of uncertainty and loneliness. The guilt of not knowing gnawed at him every day. Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice more steady this time. "I don't blame you. I don't know if I ever could. But I can't help feeling like my whole life has been a lie." Richard swallowed hard. "I understand how you feel, I do. But we can change that now. We can find her, and we can stop Reyes from doing this to anyone else." Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time since they had started this journey, Richard saw something new in her eyes, a glimmer of hope. It was faint, but it was there. She had spent her whole life feeling lost, adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. But now, there was a sense of direction, a purpose that tied her to something larger than herself. "We'll find her," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "And when we do, I want her to know that she wasn't alone, that I never gave up on her." Richard's chest tightened with emotion. He reached across the table and placed his hand over Sarah's. "She'll know, Sarah. I promise you, she'll know." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Frank had managed to track down an associate of Reyes's, a man named Victor, who had been involved in some of the darker aspects of Reyes's operations. Frank arranged a meeting with him, hoping to extract information about Emily's whereabouts. The meeting was set in a quiet, secluded bar on the outskirts of the city. Richard and Sarah arrived early, the tension between them palpable as they waited for Victor to show up. Frank had warned them that this man wasn't to be trusted, but he was their best lead. When Victor finally walked in, he looked every bit the part of someone who had spent his life on the wrong side of the law. He was wiry, with a face marked by years of hard living, his eyes constantly shifting as if he were always on the lookout for trouble. He slid into the booth across from Richard and Sarah without a word, his gaze flickering between them. "You're the ones looking for Reyes," Victor said, his voice low and gravelly. "Frank tells me you're willing to pay for information." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm willing to pay for the truth." Victor smirked, but there was no warmth in it. "Truth doesn't come cheap." Richard leaned forward, his voice cold. "Neither does betrayal, but I'm sure you know that already." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Walker. You're playing in dangerous territory. Reyes doesn't like people poking around his business." Richard held his gaze, unflinching. "He took my wife. He took my daughter. This stopped being just business a long time ago." Victor shifted uncomfortably, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Reyes has her. I don't know where. But I know she's alive. He's been keeping her somewhere off the grid, far away from the city. He doesn't want anyone finding her." The word sent a shockwave through Richard. Emily was alive. After all these years, she was still out there. "Where is she?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling with urgency. Victor shook his head. "I don't know exactly, but I can point you in the right direction. There's a cabin upstate, in the mountains. It's isolated, hard to get to. If Reyes is hiding her anywhere, it's there." Richard felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They finally had a lead. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and now they were closer than ever to finding Emily. As they left the bar, Sarah looked up at Richard, her face a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you think she's really there?" Richard nodded, his voice steady. "I do, and we're going to bring her home." The cabin Victor had told them about was tucked away in the mountains, a place so remote that it felt like the end of the world. Richard, Sarah, and Frank had driven for hours through winding roads, the landscape growing more desolate with each passing mile. The further they went, the more Richard felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. This could be it. Emily could be just a few miles away, alive after all these years. Beside him, Sarah was quiet, her face pale and drawn. Richard knew she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. She had been through so much already, discovering her true identity, learning about her mother's kidnapping, and now facing the possibility of reuniting with the woman she had never known. He could only imagine what was going through her mind, but he felt a responsibility to keep her strong, to protect her from whatever they might find. Frank had been quiet for most of the trip, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was experienced in dealing with dangerous situations, but even he seemed uneasy about this one. Dominic Reyes was not a man to be underestimated. If Reyes really was keeping Emily here, there was no telling what kind of security or defenses he had in place. As they pulled up to a narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, Frank cut the engine and turned to Richard. "This is as close as we're going to get without being spotted," he said, his voice low. "From here, we go on foot." Richard nodded. "Let's do it." Sarah climbed out of the car without a word, her expression grim. Richard noticed her hands shaking slightly, but when he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, she straightened her posture, forcing herself to remain calm. This was it. They were on the edge of finally discovering the truth. The three of them moved quietly through the dense trees, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves the only noise around them. The cabin came into view just as Victor had described it. Small, isolated, and surrounded by thick woods. It looked abandoned, but Richard knew better. There was no way Reyes would leave Emily here unguarded. Frank motioned for them to stop as they reached a clearing just before the cabin. "I'll go ahead and check things out," he whispered. "Stay here and wait for my signal." Richard nodded, watching as Frank slipped silently into the shadows, moving toward the cabin like a ghost. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel Sarah's tension growing beside him. "What if she's not here?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with fear. "She's here," Richard said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "We'll find her." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Frank reappeared, signaling for them to follow. They crept through the trees and up to the edge of the cabin, where Frank pointed to a window on the side. "There's someone inside," he whispered. "I couldn't get a clear view, but it looks like a woman. She's alone." Richard felt his heart leap in his chest. Could it be Emily? "Let's move," Richard said, his voice filled with quiet determination. They made their way to the front door, and Frank carefully tried the handle. It was unlocked. With a quick nod to Richard, Frank pushed the door open slowly, and they stepped inside. The cabin was dimly lit, with sparse furniture and the faint smell of dust hanging in the air. In the far corner of the room, a figure sat on a worn-out couch, her back to them. Richard froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was a woman, her hair long and dark, just like Emily's had been. "Emily," Richard called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman didn't move. Richard's pulse raced as he stepped closer, his heart pounding louder with every step. He had waited for this moment for 20 years, had dreamed of it every night. But now that it was happening, he was terrified. What if she didn't remember him? What if she had been so broken by the years of captivity that she wasn't the same person he had loved? He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said again, his voice trembling. Slowly, the woman turned to face him, and Richard felt his knees go weak. It was her. It was Emily. Her face was thinner, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and pain. But it was her. The woman he had loved. The woman he had lost. Richard. Emily's voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in years. She blinked up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "It's me," Richard said, his voice breaking. "It's really me." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the years of separation, the pain, and the loss all swirling between them. Then, slowly, Emily's expression softened, and tears filled her eyes. "You came," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You found me." Richard felt tears well up in his own eyes as he pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered into her hair. "I never gave up." Behind him, Sarah stood frozen in place, her eyes wide as she stared at the woman who had given her life. The mother she had never known was right in front of her, and yet, the distance between them felt insurmountable. Richard pulled back slightly, glancing over his shoulder at Sarah. "Emily," he said softly, "there's someone you need to meet." Emily looked past Richard, her gaze landing on Sarah. For a moment, she didn't seem to understand, but then, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her face pale. "Mom," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. In an instant, Emily's face crumpled, and she reached out to her daughter, her hands shaking. "Oh my God, Sarah, my baby." Sarah rushed forward, collapsing into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as years of pain and loneliness melted away in the warmth of her mother's embrace. For the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't alone. She had found her family. They had found each other. But even as the long-awaited reunion unfolded, a dark shadow still lingered in the back of Richard's mind. Dominic Reyes was still out there, and he wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The reunion between Emily and Sarah was as emotional as Richard had anticipated. He watched as mother and daughter clung to each other, their tears flowing freely, releasing the years of grief and separation that had haunted both of them. But even as his heart swelled with relief and gratitude, Richard couldn't shake the nagging sense of danger that lingered in the back of his mind. Dominic Reyes was still out there, and Richard knew the man well enough to understand that Reyes wouldn't let them walk away unscathed. After a few moments, Richard gently pulled Sarah and Emily apart, his tone serious as he addressed them. "We have to go. Now." Emily looked up at him, her eyes still full of tears. "Richard, how did you find me? I thought—" Her voice broke, and she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. "I never gave up," Richard said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "But we're not safe yet. Reyes knows we're close. We need to get you out of here." Emily nodded, her face pale and worn from years of captivity. She stood slowly, her legs trembling slightly as she leaned on Richard for support. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice shaky. "You're stronger than you think," Richard said, guiding her toward the door. "We'll get through this. Together." Frank, who had been standing guard near the cabin's entrance, motioned for them to move quickly. "We need to go now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not sure how much longer we have before Reyes figures out what's going on." Richard nodded in agreement, helping Emily into the car as Sarah climbed into the back seat. Frank started the engine, and they sped off down the dirt road, leaving the cabin behind. The mountain roads were winding and treacherous, but Frank kept his focus, navigating the sharp turns with precision. The tension in the car was thick, the silence punctuated only by the occasional sound of the tires skidding on loose gravel. Richard sat in the front seat, his mind racing as he tried to figure out their next move. They needed to get far away from Reyes, but more importantly, they needed to figure out how to stop him once and for all. As they drove deeper into the forest, Richard noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights. His stomach dropped. "We've got company," he muttered, his voice tight. Frank glanced in the mirror, his expression darkening. "Damn it, they're on to us." Sarah turned in her seat, her eyes widening as she saw the headlights approaching quickly from behind. "What do we do?" "We keep moving," Frank said, his voice tense. "But if they catch up to us, things could get ugly." The car behind them sped up, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. Richard clenched his fists, his mind racing as he considered their options. They were trapped on a narrow mountain road, and it was only a matter of time before Reyes's men caught up. "We can't outrun them on these roads," Richard said, his voice grim. "We need to find another way." "There's a turnoff up ahead," Frank replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "It leads down to an old service road. It's rough, but it might give us some cover." "Do it," Richard said, his jaw clenched. Frank nodded, gripping the wheel tightly as he veered sharply to the right, taking the turnoff at the last second. The car bounced violently as they hit the uneven road, the headlights behind them momentarily disappearing into the trees. For a brief moment, Richard allowed himself to hope that they might have lost their pursuers, but that hope was short-lived. The headlights reappeared, and the sound of roaring engines grew louder. "They're not giving up," Sarah said, her voice filled with fear. "Hold on," Frank growled, his knuckles white as he swerved the car down the narrow, rocky path. The vehicle shook as they navigated the rough terrain, but Frank kept his foot on the gas, determined to keep them ahead of Reyes's men. The trees closed in around them, the darkness of the forest thickening as the road grew more treacherous. Richard glanced at Emily, who sat in stunned silence, her eyes wide with fear. "It's going to be okay," Richard said, trying to reassure her. "We're almost out of here." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The car behind them was gaining ground, and Richard knew that a confrontation was inevitable. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, followed by the unmistakable sound of the car's back tire blowing out. The vehicle lurched violently to the side, and Frank struggled to keep it under control, but it was too late. The car skidded off the road, crashing into the trees. "Everybody out!" Frank shouted, his voice hoarse as he unbuckled his seatbelt. Richard and Sarah scrambled out of the car, helping Emily to her feet as Frank quickly assessed the damage. The car was stuck, the tire completely blown out and the frame wedged against a tree. They were stranded. "We have to move," Frank said urgently. "They're right behind us." Richard grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her into the trees, Sarah close behind them. The forest was thick and disorienting, but they didn't have a choice. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of Reyes's men. As they stumbled through the underbrush, the sound of footsteps and voices grew closer. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They were running out of time. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. Sarah screamed, ducking as the sound reverberated around them. "Go!" Richard shouted, pushing Emily and Sarah forward. "Keep moving." Another gunshot, and then the sound of footsteps getting closer. Richard turned, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of their pursuers. He could hear them now, the low murmur of voices as they closed in. "We can't outrun them," Frank said, panting as he caught up to Richard. "We have to fight." Richard's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but he knew Frank was right. They couldn't keep running forever. "Then we fight," Richard said, his voice hard. "But we're not going down without a fight." The footsteps grew closer, the shadows shifting in the darkness. Richard's pulse raced as he prepared himself for what was coming. This was it, the final confrontation, and he was ready to do whatever it took to protect his family. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crackling of twigs underfoot and the distant rustle of leaves. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, keeping Emily and Sarah behind him. The darkness surrounded them like a thick blanket, making it difficult to tell where Reyes's men were coming from. But the unmistakable sound of footsteps was closing in. Frank was beside him, his eyes sharp as he scanned the area, listening for any movement. They had no choice now but to face their enemies head-on. Richard could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Years of searching, years of pain and loss. And now it all came to this moment. "We stick together," Richard whispered to Frank. "We protect them at all costs." Frank gave a quick nod, his jaw clenched. "I'll take the front. You stay close to Emily and Sarah." Another gunshot echoed through the trees, the sound reverberating in the still night. Richard's pulse quickened, his protective instincts kicking in. He crouched lower, pulling Emily and Sarah closer to him. "Stay down," he whispered urgently to them, his voice low and controlled. "Don't move until I say so." Emily's hand trembled in his, and he could see the fear etched on her face, but she nodded, trusting him implicitly. Sarah's face was pale, her wide eyes darting around as she tried to remain calm. Despite her fear, there was a strength in her that reminded Richard of Emily, the same determination, the same will to survive. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the shadows ahead, and without hesitation, Frank lunged forward. He moved with precision, tackling the man to the ground before he had a chance to react. There was a brief struggle, and then the unmistakable sound of a gun clattering to the ground. Frank stood up, breathing heavily, his face set in grim determination. "They're coming," Frank muttered, his voice strained. "Get ready." Richard tensed, his senses on high alert. He could hear more footsteps approaching, and he knew they were running out of time. The odds were stacked against them, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not after coming this far. As the shadows shifted, more figures emerged from the trees. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of them, Dominic Reyes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes scanning the forest, his face twisted in a smug grin. "Well, well, well," Reyes sneered, stepping forward slowly. Richard Walker, always so predictable. Richard stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "It's over, Reyes," he growled. "Let her go. Let us all go." Reyes chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You really think you're in a position to make demands? After all these years, you're still the same, always thinking you're in control." "You have nothing left," Richard said, his voice steady. "We found Emily. We know everything. There's nowhere left for you to hide. Reyes's eyes darkened, and he took another step forward, his hand hovering dangerously close to the gun tucked into his waistband. You don't understand, Walker. This isn't about hiding. This is about winning, and I always win. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down the man who had stolen everything from him. This was the moment. It had all led to this. But even as Reyes sneered, Richard knew that the fight wasn't about him anymore. It was about Emily, about Sarah, about protecting his family from the man who had tried to destroy them. I'm not here to play your game anymore, Richard said, his voice low and controlled. This ends now. Without warning, Reyes drew his gun, his eyes filled with rage. Time seemed to slow as Richard instinctively threw himself in front of Emily and Sarah, shielding them from the imminent danger. The sound of the gunshot pierced the air, and Richard felt a sharp, searing pain in his side. He staggered, the world spinning around him, but he didn't fall. He wouldn't fall. Dad! Sarah screamed, rushing forward to help him. I'm fine, Richard gasped, his hand pressed against the wound. Stay back. Frank, who had been waiting for the right moment, lunged at Reyes, tackling him to the ground before he could get another shot off. The two men struggled in the dirt, but Frank, fueled by years of loyalty and determination, managed to wrest the gun from Reyes's hand and toss it away. Reyes fought back, but Frank was relentless. Finally, with a swift, brutal punch, Frank knocked Reyes unconscious, leaving him lying motionless on the ground. The forest was silent again. The danger passed, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. Richard sank to his knees, his breath ragged, the pain in his side throbbing with each pulse. Sarah was at his side in an instant, her hands trembling as she tried to help him. You're hurt, she said, her voice thick with panic. I'll be all right, Richard said, though his voice was strained. He looked over at Emily, who stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock. It's over. Frank stood over Reyes, breathing heavily, his eyes narrowed in disgust. He won't be getting up anytime soon. Richard nodded, his vision swimming slightly as the adrenaline started to wear off. He looked at Sarah and Emily, the two people he had fought so hard to protect, and despite the pain, a sense of peace settled over him. They had won. They had made it through the nightmare that Reyes had created for them. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees, casting light over the forest, Richard closed his eyes and let out a slow, relieved breath. It was finally over.